In 5 minutes, we're about to start. In 5 minutes, we're about to start. In 5 minutes, we're about to start. Please take your seats now. Good evening. The show is about to begin. As the winds of excitement gather, we invite you to take your seats.
Good evening, everyone. A very warm welcome to all of you who have joined us here in the studio, and welcome to those of you who have joined us online. Today marks an important milestone for us at Elia Group, the launch of our new study, which focuses on the benefits of offshore wind development in Europe. Let's take a moment to have a look at the study's cover, Going Like the Wind, the virtuous circle of offshore wind benefits in Europe. What can you expect from this study? Let's head over to the other side of the studio where Helen can tell us a bit more.
Good evening, everyone. Now, Going Like the Wind explores how to unlock the clean energy potential held by Europe's seas. Given the threat of climate change, the rising demand for electricity, and concerns about Europe's energy independence, offshore wind is becoming increasingly prominent in discussions about the continent's future energy mix. However, several challenges currently stand in the way of the development of offshore wind power. Firstly, Europe's offshore energy potential is not evenly distributed across its member states. Some countries have an offshore renewable energy potential that exceeds their domestic demand, and other countries don't have enough offshore renewable energy to meet their demand. And the second challenge is that offshore development projects need sufficient streams of financing. Now, one key thing to note is that these challenges need to be solved as quickly as possible. Europe needs to speed up its work in this area to ensure that the right amount of offshore capacity can be built in time.
Thanks, Helen. Indeed, these topics will be covered by our experts. Throughout the evening, we will also be joined by Stefan Kapferer, the CEO of our German subsidiary 50 Hertz, and Frédéric Dunant, the CEO of our Belgian subsidiary, Elia Transmission Belgium. They will help us to reflect further on some of tonight's key messages. In preparation for our viewpoint, we engaged with many stakeholders from the European energy sector. We will be sharing some of their thoughts with you throughout the evening. And of course, no launch of our latest study would be possible without valuable contributions from our experts. But before we call them on stage, Marlene, could you first take us through the concept of a virtuous circle?
Well, a virtuous circle represents a positive circle of events, and each component of the circle contributes to the success of the next. And that might sound a little bit abstract at this point, but let me give you a little sneak peek of what we mean by this. On screen now, you can see the 4 elements of our virtuous circle: international collaboration, joint planning, common funding, and cost-benefit sharing, and finally, scaling up the supply chain. It's important to understand that this virtuous circle will only come to life when all the challenges are tackled at the same time. So cherry-picking from the list, it's not an option.
This circle of benefits serves several goals, making Europe's electricity system more sustainable, more independent, and more resilient. At the start of September, the so-called Draghi report was published and presented to the European Commission. This highlights the high cost of energy as a significant barrier to the competitiveness of European businesses. This will be one of the Commission's focus areas under President von der Leyen.
We must support our industry to go through decarbonization, through innovation, and turn this into a competitive advantage. And this is why we need to act on all the principal levers that are at our disposal. That is bringing down the energy prices, mobilizing public and private investment, improving the business environment, and cutting necessary red tape.
So we have to have in place a plan that first and foremost aims at decoupling the price of fossil fuel energy from clean energy sources so that end users see the benefits of decarbonization in their bills. What we have to do is really to increase the supply of clean energy.
And although Draghi didn't mention this explicitly during his press conference, the report states that one central element for accelerating decarbonization will be unlocking the potential of clean energy through a collective European focus on grids. Katrien van der Bode, Interim CEO, Elia Group, welcome. This reference to a collective focus on grids, could this indicate that there is a new mindset?
Yeah, sure, Marlene. So I think when Mario Draghi is calling for a collective focus on grids, he's referring, among others, to offshore interconnectors. And we know that those projects are extremely important for delivering on the potential of the offshore in Europe. And so that's the reason why Draghi is calling for more of them. They will benefit not only to the countries being interconnected through this type of asset, but more broadly to the entire European energy system. So clearly there is a call for action there. But at the same time, if we look at the number of projects that are currently planned beyond 2030, there is only a few. And that's linked to the risks perceived with this type of assets. When project developers start looking at them, they often fall into the discussion about sharing of cost and benefit. And that's exactly the reason why we publish tonight this new viewpoint, this study, in which we come with a number of concrete proposals in order to help unlocking the full potential of offshore. And I think it's really the moment to do it, because on the one hand, soon we'll have a new commission getting in motion. And second, on the other hand, we are preparing the third North Sea Summit in Hamburg in June 2025. And so there is a momentum to come with a number of new ideas and also to drive progress on those topics. At the same time, it's urgent to do it now. If we look at the time which is necessary to build such interconnectors, we really need to start doing it now. And for this reason, I think it's very good to see that the sentiment of urgency is shared at the highest level at European Commission, but also amongst the TSOs in Europe.
Yeah, okay, let's listen to some reactions from our counterparts.
It's actually so complex that I don't think any particular actor has the solution. So I think we need to get together, TSOs, governments, European institutions, to try to find solutions for this complex problem. But if we do, I think the rewards are great.
Sometimes I compare it with a turtle. So you see sometimes more and more that countries, go back into their own national shell. But I think if we want to be independent of fossil fuels or Russian gas, we need to be willing to be more dependent, right, of the like-minded countries, and we need to even more collaborate together on a European level, but of course, for example, also with the North Sea countries.
If we just think about from the UK perspective, if we build large amounts of offshore wind, those projects are more economic if they know they can export to Belgium and to other countries when demand is low in the UK. So it helps us build out our own wind production. But equally, the wind doesn't blow all the time, or other sources of energy may be coming off. And so then to know that we can import from Belgium and from other countries helps us fill the gaps. So it's a real win-win. And there's actually a certain level of renewables that requires interconnection in order for it to be economic. We can't do it alone.
This need for a collective focus is clear, I think. In fact, it's something Elia Group has been focusing on for some time, as can be seen from our recent publication of studies on offshore wind development and hybrid interconnectors in particular. In April this year, we launched a joint paper with the Danish energy company Ørsted entitled Making Hybrids Happen. We proposed a regional planning approach to the development of offshore wind at sea basin level. We also proposed the concept of a so-called offshore investment bank. The Danish Minister of Energy, Lars Aagaard, was one of our guests during the paper's launch. These are some of the thoughts he shared about offshore wind development in Europe.
We need to coordinate our planning at a much larger scale among the countries. Right now, a lot of things has to be built towards 2030, but what will happen after is not that clear. And then there's the sharing of, we would like to share the benefits, but along with that goes also sharing the cost and the risks. And it can be extremely difficult handling if we only have that discussion among the two countries that are directly linked. So I think we need to find a common European way of de-risking some of these projects.
Yeah, you see, Minister Aagaard also confirms the need for a coordinated approach to the planning of the projects. Katrien, how does the paper with Ørsted, how does it differ from today's study?
Yeah, I think the paper with Ørsted was very much about raising awareness in the community and focusing on not only joint planning, especially for hybrid interconnectors, but also on funding. And since then, we started interacting with many players, and we discussed the way forward. So it allows us to refine a number of concepts, and today we come with a greater focus on the common planification together with other TSOs from the same sea basin, but also with wind farms. We see there the possibility to be much more efficient than before by better taking into consideration wake losses, but also long-distance interconnectors. Last element, I think very important like usual, those studies are based on facts, they are based on data, they are based on figures, and so we demonstrate and we quantify the benefits of the approach that we are laying down.
Yeah, and we will present them during the show. Thank you, Catherine. We see you back at the end of the event. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking her. Thank you.
Before we invite our experts to join us on stage, let's focus briefly for a moment on the growing importance of offshore wind and interconnectors for decarbonizing the European energy system. Who better to tackle this topic than Giles Dickson, the CEO of Wind Europe?
Europe needs offshore wind. It's powerful, it's a stable form of electricity production, and it's affordable. Europe today has 35 gigawatts of offshore wind, producing 4% of all the electricity we consume in Europe. By 2030, we expect to have 90 gigawatts, and by 2050, the EU wants 300 gigawatts of offshore wind. That's a huge build-out of offshore wind, and we won't achieve it if countries do it on their own. No, this needs a regional approach between governments, between the national grid operators. Cross-border planning, coordinated grid investments. That will help to lower costs. To lower costs, we also need to minimize the financing costs. All that upfront investment, if we're not careful, the financing costs can be very high indeed. And well done to Elia and Ørsted for proposing this offshore investment bank. It's a great way of reducing the financing costs of building out offshore wind and the grid connections to connect those offshore wind farms to the grid. Take a small amount of public investment, leverage large amounts of private investment, spread the risk, reduce the financing costs, make the build out of offshore wind and the grids even more affordable.
And the solutions to the challenges we've outlined seems to be quite evident when Giles Dickson's enthusiasm shines through. Let us now move on to exploring the study's messages more in detail. Welcome, Maria. Welcome, Felix. Both you are part of Elia Group's think tank, The System of the Future. You are authors of this masterpiece. Congratulations. It's a really nice report. Let's dive straight in, Maria. The investment costs for offshore wind are quite high if you compare it to onshore wind and to solar. And yet, offshore wind will become very important to make the energy transition in Europe affordable. So that may sound a little bit contradictory.
Yes, indeed. But those investment costs are only one side. The other side are those benefits and savings we can gain through this more balanced energy system. And this, it turns out that those benefits are way higher than the costs. So if we are failing to develop offshore wind in Europe, the costs will be even higher for Europe. Offshore wind and interconnectors are often and already today thought together because they form a powerful combination, and we will come later to why this is the case. But one of the reasons is that it links countries with more offshore wind and those with less offshore wind potential. So interconnectors bring those affordable energy to other countries.
Yeah, so they are a powerful union. If you look at the history of offshore wind development, national radial connections were the first assets to be established. The sector then moved to developing connections that go beyond national borders, such as hybrid interconnectors. And currently, the sector is exploring even more advanced assets. In fact, we are building the world's first energy island, the Princess Elizabeth Island, off the coast of Belgium. Before we explore these concepts in detail, let's take a look at a video which introduces these ideas and also the model we used for some of the calculations for this study.
This is the North Sea. And as you can see, it's a busy place with lots of maritime spatial activities going on. For instance, ships running here in the middle, natural conservation areas for protection, areas for national defense for the military, and of course the wind farms in dark blue, like here and over here. Connecting these wind farms is challenging in this full space. Until now, most of the wind farms have been connected radially to shore. This means that a single or several wind farms share one transmission system directly to shore. It shows the shortest connection to shore. However, if all wind farms were to be connected radially, it would lead to a spaghetti-like offshore grid, which wouldn't be very efficient and also spatially infeasible. To avoid this, countries are exploring better solutions, such as common transmission corridors. These could host the transmission cables of several different wind farms, potentially belonging to different countries across the sea. And then there are hybrid interconnectors. They are interconnectors between two countries, but at the same time also connecting offshore wind farms along the way. Only one of these exists at the moment, which is the Kriegers Flak combined grid solution in the Baltic Sea between Denmark and Germany. As part of our analysis, we employed a geographic information system to identify the best possible paths for wind farm to be connected to the shore. An algorithm optimized the paths while onboarding all the other maritime activities such as protected areas, military areas, and others. The algorithm had two choices. Either it goes around other designated areas at the cost of a longer tour, or crossing other areas at some penalty cost. Penalty costs represent the extra effort that you would need to take to cross a certain area to compensate. As part of our study, we used the system to compare two scenarios. The first one we call business as usual, which follows the common rules of today's spatial planning and routing. And an alternative involves a so-called nature first approach, where we try to avoid protected areas a bit more than usual.
That was a real cool presentation. Well done, Felix. But it's clear that the nature of connections has changed. What makes those hybrid interconnectors and those cross-border radial connections, which don't exist today, what make them so appealing?
Thank you, Marlene. So the beauty of those connections that go cross borders is sometimes, in fact, their distance. And that sounds a bit contradictory because distance drives cost, but there is a benefit to it. And let's watch a map of the North Sea and Baltic Sea once more. And you see on the screen the wind farm areas of the future that could be there by 2050. And in colors, we indicate a concept called correlation of wind speeds. Take Belgium, bottom left, in yellow. So as this as a reference, we look further away from Belgium and see that correlation values decrease. It means that the further away you move from Belgium, chances are high that when you don't have domestic wind in Dunkelflauters, for instance, or just on less windy days, chances are high that in the north part of the North Sea there's still wind, or in fact in the Baltic Sea. And moving across the sea then really gives you the chance to have a smoother wind infeed, because there's always some wind across the continent. It's that simple, right? The key point here is that most of these wind farms haven't been developed yet. So if we onboard this concept well, with interconnectors, with hybrids, cross-border connections, we can plan for a smoother offshore system of the future.
Yeah. As Felix just mentioned in the video we just watched, to date, only one hybrid interconnector has been realized. And the main reason for this is the lack of an appropriate framework that covers a distribution of their costs and their benefits.
I think one particular challenge which is raised in the study is the distribution of cost and benefits between exporting countries and importing countries. That's a challenge that we really have to try to find good solutions for. Because if we don't find solutions there, that may sort of hamper the development of these big hybrid offshore installations that we need to harvest the wind resources in the sea basins we have in Europe.
I think we need to rethink how we look at cost sharing and funding. This requires really, I think, a pan-European approach, and we need to somehow make sure that the countries who do kind of indirectly benefit from the North Sea are still very much incentivized in order to invest, so that we can invest together.
Katrine already mentioned this. The study calculates what value unlocking the full benefits of offshore wind could deliver for Europe's energy system. And that brings us neatly on to the study first key message. From 2030 to 2050, international collaboration, the de-risking of investments, and spatial planning and offshore wind development could lower the cost of the energy transition by more than 1,000 billion euros. Felix, that's an immense amount, 1,000 billion euros. How do you get to this figure?
Well, Marlene, it's a range of analysis that we did, and that gets you to that value. And indeed, it is many levers that you need to consider. It's joint planning, it's wake losses, as I just mentioned, it's supply chain and enhanced financing. And what we came up with is this ladder of benefits or cost reductions that you see in the energy system cost. And let's start on the left-hand side in the gray bar, which is really resembling the energy system costs for the period of 2030 to 2050. So we talk about 20 years here of operation of power plants, investment into power, cabled overhead lines, renewable energies, but also imports for fuels. And this is what the cost is for entire Europe in this scenario without a lot of offshore wind. Now, we can do better than this, and Maria told this already. It's cheaper to embark on offshore wind, and this is what the turquoise first step in this letter tells you. We call this the benefit of joint planning and funding, where we basically say that if you develop offshore wind, you have a cheaper energy system. You have more renewables in the mix, you have less thermal generation, less CO2 allowances that you need to pay for, and more importantly, you have a more efficient internal energy market. As a result of this joint planning, you also have reduced wake losses, and we will have a second explainer on that in a minute, but this is basically the first half of the benefit.
Yeah, it's a really important graphic. It's the main graphic, I think, from the study, so let's deep dive a little bit further, because the savings that we see, they go further than just only the savings for the energy system.
Indeed, and this was also the ambition of the study to not only stick with this system cost, which is the most prominent example of savings. Let's talk about supply chain. Today, wind farms are developed as tailor-made solutions. So we have individual platforms, individual cable systems, and the wind farm layout itself. If we go to bulk production, more standards into this connection, we can reduce costs significantly per project, but especially in the mass of the gigawatts that we would install in the future. Think of innovations, think of factories producing more effectively. This is all hidden. You see the arrows. It can be bigger, it can be a bit smaller, but it's not to be overlooked. The same is true for something that we call enhanced financing. Yes, offshore wind is expensive, but every euro that you can spend in a less risky environment saves you on interest rate. And that is the capital cost that we can bring down. Voila, here it is as a saving in the plot.
Yeah, what can we learn from this?
3 things I would say we should take away from that. First of all, yes, offshore wind comes with a hefty price tag, but it also comes with a warranty tag. Yeah? Security of supply, enhanced market liquidity, I mentioned this already, and also just a more efficient integration of the renewable energy. The second thing is that we should mention this ladder you only get as one piece. Yeah? You cannot scale up the supply chain but then not build offshore wind. You need to do this in one step. You need to jointly embark on those levers. And the good thing is, most of this stuff hasn't happened yet. We can still pull the right levers to get those effects in due time.
Yeah.
And the last thing is really the purple one. I've slept over this in the previous explanation, the indirect benefits. It's about local value creation and not least important about the geopolitical independence of Europe to secure its energy supply. And offshore wind can contribute that, and that crosses or spreads well beyond the sector.
Okay, thanks, Felix. And I think it's even clearer now that great opportunities lie in a collective focus on European grids, as many stakeholders from across the offshore wind sector agree.
The North Sea is the most mature offshore wind province in the world, and it's now evolving from national projects with point-to-point connections to the shore to now international projects with what we call hybrid assets, where you have maybe an interconnector that could go from Belgium to the UK and connect a wind farm on the way. And I think you can see eventually that is going to lead to a meshed grid. That's the end game. And if you think about that end game, you need coordinated planning in order to manage and expand and operate a grid like that. So there will have to be, over time, at the very least, close cooperation between the system operators around the North Sea.
I think that joint planning and funding will be key to secure investments. I think it's a critical element. And because of the development of the technology, we go more and more when it comes to HVDC for multi-terminal, multi-vendor solution that will really allow to have more hybrid project with interconnection and making really mesh grids it is going to be a game changer in terms of cost, affordability, cost effectiveness. In terms of planning, I would say that ideally, from my viewpoint, we should go for the planning of the grid at the same time than the planning of the wind, or even before. But the future is going to be clearly with this approach of joint planning and securing the investment in order to have more mesh grids rather than messy grids.
I think this year's Viewpoint study has the immense merit of assessing a lot of the challenges and issues that are affecting the build-out of offshore wind energy in Europe right now. I think a huge part of this, and this is something that we in our work have considered and analyzed many times, is the lack of not just international cooperation, but specifically international cooperation involving several countries at the same time. So in the framework, for instance, of a sea basin such as the Baltic Sea or the North Sea, we see that countries, when they do work together, it's to build an interconnector, you know, and we really welcome initiatives such as the energy islands, which are springing up or being started in the North Sea as well as the Baltic. These are great initiatives. This is really the way of the future, and I think this is something that governments can do a lot to support.
So if we adopt a coordinated approach to the planning of offshore wind projects, what will this mean for the location of offshore wind farms and the total capacity that Europe can establish by 2050? And the answer lies in the second message of the study. Adopting a coordinated approach is required for Europe to tap into the most efficient offshore wind location and harness almost 500 gigawatts of offshore wind energy by 2050. Maria, Giles Dixon, in his statement, he said, okay, today we have developed 35 gigawatt of offshore wind. We have to evolve towards 500 gigawatts. Where do we have to put all those wind turbines?
Indeed, that's a concern. So we saw already earlier, Felix mentioning that in the video, that the seas are really busy places. And as you see on the screen, there's this map that Helen showed before, that there's not every country has the same potential for offshore wind. So we were wondering which of those countries will really develop those 500 gigawatts. Will it be the countries which have more potential but less need, so those exporting countries, or will it be those countries which have more need and less potential, so the ones which are importing? So the results are shown here on the left-hand side, and you can see we carried these out based on the ENSO-E's 2024 network development plan. And what you can see is that a significant amount of those offshore wind after 2030 will be built out in the countries which are exporting. So depending on the scenario, it will be around 200 gigawatts.
Yeah, and what does these results tell us?
Yeah, so it tells us that if we really want to achieve the target of the 500 gigawatts, we need those exporting countries. So if we fail to include them, right, then we won't develop those targets. And how can we achieve this? So we need incentives for them because, of course, they lack at the moment an appetite for supporting the costs of offshore wind because they don't need it for themselves.
Yeah. If we plan all those wind farms, are there some considerations that we have to take into account, Felix?
Definitely, Marlene. And again, it's about space. So let's zoom in into the North Sea. You see again in dark blue or in shades of blue the areas of the future wind farms that we can expect by 2050 if we go to those capacities that Maria just mentioned. And what you also see is that there is this stripe of wind farms between Belgium and Denmark. The second map tells you where those wind speeds come from, basically, or the wind directions, rather. In southern Belgium, you see, for instance, it comes from the southwest through the English Channel, but so in Dutch waters and German waters, we have southwesterly winds. Now, 30% of the future offshore capacity in the North Sea will be in that wind corridor. Hence, the first wind farm in the row takes a couple of energy away, and then the next wind farm is left with less energy, right? And this is what we call wake effects, and my colleague Annalena will explain you what this is about.
Let's imagine the wind is blowing in this direction. The area downstream of the wind turbine is known as its wake. The air that flows through the blades of the turbine and downstream of it is disturbed and its speed is reduced. This is known as the wake effect. This effect impacts neighboring wind turbines of the same wind farm, as well as neighboring wind farms located up to 100 kilometers downstream of it. Our analysis focuses on the latter, the wake effect that impacts neighboring wind farms. The wake effect intensifies as the number and size of wind farms in the seas is increasing. Our findings demonstrate that the wake effect leads to electricity production losses downstream of 10 to 30%. This effect is particularly challenging in the North Sea, specifically this area here, ranging from the English Channel to the coasts of Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany and Denmark. Given current offshore wind development plans, it's likely that around 1/3 of all future offshore wind capacity in the North Sea will be built in this area here. The main wind direction is blowing southwesterly, meaning that wake effects can build up across country borders. As part of our analysis, we focused on a particularly challenging area, the German Bay here. We calculated the expected energy losses in this area, given the high number of wind farms located close to each other. We were then able to show how cross-border collaboration will be able to mitigate some of these losses. By spreading out wind farms and leaving more space between them, the wake loss effect can be reduced.
Wake effects can cause electricity production losses of 10 to 30% in downstream wind farms. An efficient approach to planning will be key. Felix, what are possible solutions to cope with those wake effects?
Let's stick a bit in the German Bay that Annalena already mentioned. And speaking about wake effects, it's really about the energy budget of the atmosphere. So if you take something out, something is left in the sea, or the wind. And for the German case, or for the German Bay case of Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark, we performed an analysis for those wake effects, and we measure them in reduction of full load hours, so basically the efficiency of the wind farms. And if we continue with our current planning between 2030 and 2050 with those high capacities, you see Germany is dark purple, meaning that it is prone to high wake losses, not entirely, but individual wind farms, of course. The second thing I want you to notice is that also Denmark is rather dark, not saying that they have so many wind farms, but the cross-border piling up of wind effects that Annalena just mentioned will be visible there or measurable according to our calculations. So what can we do? Well, basically, we need to improve the room for refreshment, which can be that we space out some of the wind farms within the exclusive economic areas. And this is shown on the second map. It reduces the wake effect, but not eliminate it, right? Also important to say, in Germany, this is a rather theoretical exercise because the space is already heavily used, but just by the means of options that we have, this could be a variant to reduce wake losses. Now, the second thing is, and this is really to understand, the wind doesn't care for our borders, right? It just blows across the sea. So the second thing we can do is collaborate across borders to acknowledge this fact, meaning that some of the capacity from Germany we could move, for instance, towards Danish waters. And this could then, again, spread out the wind farms, reduce the wake losses, as you can see with the paler shades of purple here. In this particular example, we would gain about 8 to 9 gigawatts of offshore wind that is not being lost anymore in the wind. This is the whole domestic offshore wind fleet of Belgium in 2050, so not nothing. In terms of cost, you saw this on the ladder plot in the beginning. This is about 20 billion in capex savings.
That's huge. Thank you, Felix. So far this evening, we've mainly discussed examples from the North Sea, but we shouldn't forget that 50Hertz, our German subsidiary, has realized most of its projects in the Baltic Sea. Let's head over to Helen to find out more.
Thank you, Marlene. Now, since wake effects are less of an issue in the Baltic Sea, I'd like to focus instead on a key asset that Felix and Marlene mentioned in passing earlier on, the Kriegers Flak combined grid solution. Now, this project, which is an interconnector that links Germany to Denmark, is a great example of successful offshore collaboration. And to discuss this further, I've been joined by Stefan Kapferer, the CEO of 50Hertz. Stefan, welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. Can you tell us how the interconnector delivers benefits for both countries?
Yeah, the Kriegers Flak combined grid solution is really a quick win, not only for the single market for energy in Europe, it's also a quick win for the energy transition. Because looking at the map of the Baltic Sea, it was obvious that it is only a short distance to be bridged, not only to connect Denmark and Germany, but also to integrate 2 offshore wind farms, one in Denmark and one in Germany. So it was really the first hybrid interconnector in the world. And it was commissioned 3 years ago. And the figures and facts are very transparent. And you can see there are really benefits for both member states of the European Union. It's not only integrating more renewable energy, it's also really true that we can use the combined grid solution as an interconnector. Normally, you should reach 70% of trade capacity in such an interconnector, and we are often very close to this 70%. And it's not only a one-way interconnector. It's not only transporting electricity from Denmark to Germany. It's also, in 1/3 of the time, transporting electricity to Denmark, so benefits for both countries.
Right, that's clear. Thank you. Now, in line with this, we have a statement to share with you from Stefan Timm, the head of the German Wind Energy Association. He's outlining his desire to see Germany and Denmark further their collaboration.
Also das Wichtigste, was ich aus dieser Studie mitnehme, ist, dass wir die internationale Zusammenarbeit nicht überschätzen können. Offshore-Windenergie war schon immer ein internationales Thema. Das sehen wir auch an der North Sea Energy Corporation. Mit Blick auf die internationale Zusammenarbeit möchte ich ganz besonders darauf eingehen, dass wir uns dafür einsetzen, dass die Zusammenarbeit zwischen Deutschland und Dänemark deutlich intensiviert wird. Wie die Studie zum Beispiel auch sagt, dass wir die Meeresflächen Dänemarks intensiver nutzen könnten, um Offshore-Windenergieanlagen dort zu implementieren, die dann Strom nach Deutschland liefern. Und auf diese Weise könnten wir nämlich Abschattungseffekte reduzieren und schlussendlich dann die Energie auch deutlich effizienter erzeugen. Das finden wir gut. Allerdings muss man natürlich dazu sagen, dass dies einen völkerrechtlichen Vertrag zwischen Deutschland und Dänemark voraussetzt, was wir ausdrücklich empfehlen würden.
As Mr. Timm says, a cross-border radio connection would see Germany benefiting from offshore wind farms in Danish waters. As we said earlier, in fact, as Felix and Marlene both mentioned, no such asset exists to date, but they will be beneficial to consider for the future. Stefan, maybe let's move on to more concrete projects which are currently underway. 50 Hertz is working on a second interconnector between both countries, Denmark and Germany, as part of the Bornholm Energy Island project. Now, this project will see the island of Bornholm being developed into an energy hub. Can you tell us how this project is progressing?
Yeah, we have seen 2 obvious reasons for these kind of projects. One reason is we have in the Baltic Sea exporting countries and importing countries. And obviously, Denmark is an exporting country and Germany is short on renewable energy. So very clear situation. And on the other hand, it's also obvious that we can avoid wake effects. Felix just explained it, by moving with wind farms to areas where it's not so a busy situation when we talk about these kind of wind farms. And the progress is quite strong. There is a state treaty in place between Denmark and Germany. It's, of course, also a treaty in place between Energinet and 50 Hertz. It's a fruitful and trustful cooperation since many years now. We've started the tender procedure for the converter station. So these are all clear signals. We all want to realize this project. It's really helping us to realize the energy transition.
Yes, and now maybe let's look forward. In a year or so, we have a hopeful event that's on the horizon, the 3rd edition of the North Sea Summit, which is going to be hosted in June in Germany, in fact, in Hamburg, in 50 Hertz's control area. What are your expectations for this summit?
Yeah, Katrin mentioned a minute ago the Ostende conference and also the Hamburg conference. And it's obvious to all of us, there is a strong commitment by heads of governments, heads of state. We have seen it in Ostende. The presence was really impressive. And I would expect a similar situation for Hamburg. But obviously, we need now the next step in the process. It's no longer enough to talk about ambitions. It's no longer enough to show the commitment to the process. We need now real concrete projects to be realized in the North Sea and the Baltic Sea in the next decade. And I would expect that Hamburg gives a starting point for these concrete projects.
And what kind of actors will need to be getting together to work on these future projects?
Yeah, I think we have heard several times, Helen, today that there are some challenges ahead of us. One obviously is about integrated, coordinated planning. That's a role of the TSOs. We have the expertise. We can do that, no doubt about it. Then we have heard one bottleneck is the supply chain situation. That's something more the Commission, the national governments have to work on, not by investing directly in additional manufacturing capacities, but with the right framework, with a harbor policy, with a shipyard policy, also about converter stations. We need a broader manufacturing capacity in the future. And the last bottleneck, obviously, is the funding. It was mentioned several times today that the Offshore Investment Bank is a very concrete and good proposal made by Elia Group, and that's something we have to further discuss with politics now.
Right, so some key kind of messages and calls to action for European leaders and policymakers there. Now, before you leave us, what is your key takeaway for us this evening?
Yeah, I think the message of the viewpoint is very clear. When we talk about offshore wind, it's not only one benefit for all of us. The obvious benefit is tackling climate change will only work with the higher potential of offshore wind. But it's also strengthening the industrial basis of Europe when we talk about the manufacturing capacities on the supply side. It's creating additional jobs in many member states, service jobs, but also industrial jobs. And of course, it's also strengthening the resilience of the European energy system. So the virtuous circle of offshore wind is obvious to me.
Sure. Thank you, Stefan, for joining us.
Thanks,
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking him.
Let's move on to the next element of our virtuous circle, which is about money. How can we streamline the financial resources for offshore projects? Moreover, the adoption of de-risking measures is just as important, because if you de-risk projects, they will become more affordable for everybody involved, as some of our stakeholders and partners confirm in this next video.
I think de-risking the projects, I mean, there is a tremendous investment needed. And it starts with the supply chain, but also the scale of the project. And at the end, what we need to do as an industry, deliver on time with the quality and reliability that's needed and the cost that's needed. And I think that's where we need to really optimize, because once you de-risk it, it also becomes more affordable to everybody. So I think clear boundary conditions, a clear perspective, what needs to get done by when, and then it's really project execution that can be repeated over and over again to really get that operational and project excellence that's needed.
I think an investment bank for the North Sea basin, which can spread risk and make finance available to everybody developing projects in that basin, that would really help. I also think there's a lot of different economic regulatory mechanisms for different projects, and some more harmonization and simplification with a focus on reducing risk is a win-win scenario. If the risk is low, the cost of capital is low, and ultimately the end customer benefits.
The question is not necessarily to say, are we capable today? Do we have the right visibility and the right commitment from our customers in order for us to invest and to dimension what is necessary to deliver? If we get this visibility, this level of commitment, and we're capable in advance to get prepared, yes, definitely yes.
Let's talk about money. Europe's ambitions in offshore wind development are huge. Maria, do we have any idea what the expected cost of it will be?
So we already saw one number of the costs. So this were the cost of the whole energy transition from 2030 to 2050, operational and investment costs. But if we are focusing now only on the offshore part and only on the investment cost, these are around 1,000 billion euros. But this is a number. What can you imagine with this? It's just a big number. But if we are looking really on what has to happen, we see here on the screen now what is part of this investment. So it's the transmission grid, and also the generation assets. And so we see here the annual build out, which has to happen from now on. So how much more do we need to increase the annual build out? And it's between 2 times and 3 times in the next years that we have to increase this. And what does it mean? It also means, of course, that the investments, the annual investment rates have also to increase between 2 and 3 times.
Yeah, that's huge. And a huge amount of resources will be needed for this. And that brings us to the third message of the study. The funding and planning of projects go hand in hand. A joint framework to fund future offshore development will be crucial for unlocking the benefits of sea basin-wide planning. And to tell us more, we have been joined by Maurice Winhout, one of the co-authors of the study. How can we move from the current approach of funding to a joint financing framework?
Setting up a joint framework will help to efficiently streamline limited financial resources, and it will also help to better plan the grid of tomorrow. It will also be very beneficial for actually spelling out a difficult discussion regarding cost and benefit sharing. If we look at current projects that are being developed in Europe, we actually have to recognize that some of them are being stuck due to lengthy discussions. If you, for example, take the Triton Link project between Belgium and Denmark, this project would actually bring benefits for Belgium, but more overall for Europe as a whole. However, this project has been put on ice at the moment from the Danish side due to problems on the cost-benefit discussion. So if we zoom out and we look at the current cross-border cost allocation, we actually can state that we're just looking project by project with the directly involved partners, and we are only doing it individually. So we are not taking a sea basin approach for joint planning, for project ideation, and also not for cost and benefit sharing. So we have to state that the current system is not fit to plan and operate hybrid interconnector projects. And actually, to tackle this, we further, in this study, developed the concept of the offshore investment bank.
Yeah, that was already mentioned in the Orsted paper. But what is this offshore bank? Is it an actual bank, or is it more a framework for financial partnerships? Can you explain this a bit?
The offshore investment bank is actually expected to act as an intermediary to manage different funding streams from public entities, from private investors, also from TSOs and offshore wind farm developers. It will also help to oversee the sharing of costs and benefits. And very importantly, it will be the interlink between joint planning and joint funding, because those two things have to happen together. When we actually look who can bring this expertise, Stefan just mentioned that the TSOs definitely have this expertise and we should bring our knowledge to the table. However, there are also different regulatory regimes when we look at different TSOs around the sea basin, so we have to make sure that it can comply with. When you will have a look into the study, what we did on top of the Ørsted paper, we made concrete proposals how this offshore investment bank could be set up, and also how the cost-benefit sharing could be tackled better. So this is our proposal for now to stimulate the debate, but ultimately it will be upon the European policymakers to decide what's the best way forward.
Yeah, so that's a theory, but how does it work then in practice? How do you manage the projects?
Yeah, for that we actually propose a concept that's called Sea Basin Offshore Collaboration. It is a 5-step approach, and it is actually a closed circle. So we want to say we fund together what we plan together, and we plan together what we fund together. And actually, you can see it now on the screen. I would start running you through in the top middle. So it starts with a sea basin scope. All countries around a sea basin have to come together, including non-EU countries. Take Norway, take the UK. Once this is actually set up, it will allow us to identify the most beneficial projects for Europe as a whole. And those projects should also be the ones being built first. Once again, here it will be important that the TSOs bring in their expertise to actually identify sets of projects rather than individual projects, as we're doing it until today. This actually then will also help, once we have those identified, that they get backing from the political and public side. Because when several players all agree on a set of projects, support them, this will definitely help us to move forward jointly. The fourth pillar that you actually see here is the concept of the offshore investment bank. We tackled this beforehand because it is a very central approach of our concept, And the fifth one, once all the wheels actually are put into motion, spinning into each other, then we will have a more efficient and streamlined project execution.
Yeah, and that's also a virtuous circle, I would say. Yeah. Okay, joint planning across sea basins, check. Joint funding, check. So this leads us onto the next element in our virtuous circle, scaling up the supply chain.
Not so fast, Marlene. Let's take a moment to address a topic that is becoming increasingly important as we convert our seas into the power plants of the future, nature conservation. We'd now like to share some thoughts from Antonella Balaglini, the CEO of the Renewables Grid Initiative, a non-profit organization that promotes sustainable grid development.
When we started to work on offshore wind and offshore grids, we came in with the idea that there will be no opposition. It will be easier to develop this infrastructure sea. But the reality is not like this. The sea is a very busy space. So doing maritime spatial planning is essential to have a successful allocation of space. We also need to plan this development together with other actors. The conservation community is an essential player because the energy infrastructure, whenever it is built, it creates an impact on nature. And it is built next either to someone or another economic activity. So a collaborative process is absolutely essential to reduce conflicts on the site, but also to leverage the opportunities that are there, because every transition comes with threats, but also with opportunities. If we don't manage the threats, it means we only have troubles.
Now, as several stakeholders have said this evening, and as Antonella has just reiterated, collaboration is key for reducing conflicts and leveraging the opportunities offered up by our seas. I've been joined now by Frédéric Dunon, the CEO of Elia, to discuss this further. Frédéric, welcome. Thank you for joining us. What, from Elia's perspective as a transmission system operator, is your approach or our approach to working with the nature conservation community?
But I think, like Antonella just said, collaboration is key because we reconcile both nature and renewable industry, and that's essential just for social responsibility, but also because otherwise it will complicate the permits to get this infrastructure built on large scale. The chance that we have today, and like that's been said, I think by Felix, we have only 35 gigawatt installed today, and we have to scale up to 500 at a given time. Then it's still time to organize that properly, to put things on the right track. And we have not only to optimize the cost and the wake effect, like that's been discussed today, but also how we will cooperate with other activities in the sea, but also how we will impact some nature exclusive areas, how we can avoid to impact these specific areas in the future.
Right, and that's something that, in fact, Felix showed us earlier on, and we're going to revisit this now. Felix developed a new model for the study as part of this study. And essentially, they used the model to compare two different types of scenarios. So we can see, if you just have a look at those two maps, the areas in green there are the nature conservation areas. The areas in blue are where the wind farms are. And we also have some military areas there in grey. Now, the model was first programmed, as you can see on the left, to adopt a business as usual approach to the laying of transmission cables in the sea and spatial planning. And that essentially just means that the commonly adopted rules that we've adopted today for spatial planning. And then you can see on the right that the model was then asked to follow a nature-first approach to the laying of cables. And here the model really was asked to avoid nature conservation areas as much as possible. What then did Felix's team come to when they compared these two scenarios?
Then the good news is if you go for the nature-first design, you can avoid 50% of the interactions with nature-protected areas, which is quite a lot. And that comes only with an impact of 2% increase of the length of the cable that you need to connect the offshore part to the onshore. And I think it's key to discuss that all together between the countries, because as you see also on the map, these are not the same connection points. And also spatial planning needs a cooperation between the countries around the North Sea.
Yes, that's clear. Frédéric, thank you. Now, another good example of the importance of collaboration in this area is Elia's adoption of nature-inclusive design for the Princess Elizabeth Island, which is going to lie just off the coast of Belgium. Before the construction of the island began, Elia set up a co-creation process with 16 expert organizations. And together, this group defined 6 measures that would be embedded into the island's design. These measures are intended to boost biodiversity around the artificial island once it has been established. Frédéric, maybe you can talk us through some of those measures that were adopted.
Yes, indeed, we decided to implement a few measures. Some example of that's the structure that we put on the walls of the island, and it will allow the birds to rest, but also to breathe in. We'll also put some reliefs panel on the walls underwater, and to allow basically some small maritime species to rest in, but also to forage for food in. We'll also install, like we see on the video, some oyster table to accelerate the development of oyster reef in this area.
Right.
And I think it's really key also, that's something we also agreed with the ONG, that we will monitor all these measures afterwards, just to see how impactful it is, which are the results, to learn about it, because that's the first of a kind. And we want also that all the players in the North Sea, in the Baltic Sea, that can benefit out of it to the future, for the future installations.
Right. So everyone, in fact, is going to be looking forward to the results of this approach. Now that I have you with me on stage, I just want to touch very briefly on another study that Elia produced recently in Belgium, the Blueprint study, which looked at Belgium's electricity system in the run-up to 2050. Now, Belgium's electricity consumption is going to double over the next 25 years. So if the country doesn't want to rely too much on imports of electricity, we need additional large-scale electricity sources across the country. Can you tell us what role offshore wind is going to play in Belgium's future energy mix, and also how that connects with this study today?
Basically, why we did a study, or we decided to do the study 1 year ago, is that we will have to plan the infrastructure for the next decades in the next years. And we also see that it's quite dependent of the energy mix that we will have in Belgium, and we hope that the next government will take some decisions about it to give some guidelines. And therefore, we did the analysis to compare which are the impacts, technical, economical impact of the different kinds of energy mix. And if we look at the central scenarios that we have discussed with all the stakeholders, we see that there is an advantage for offshore wind compared to nuclear. And we will need one of them, of a combination of both, because we do not have enough renewables on our territory, on and offshore. Then we need to go for other solutions to allow Belgium to decarbonize. That's the main idea. And then indeed we confirm there is an advantage for offshore wind in this study. But again, like we discussed today, that's the purpose of the viewpoint. It will request cooperation between the countries. It will request cooperation regarding the fundings and planification. Otherwise, you just not realize. And the best example, that's already mentioned by Maurice today, that's the Triton connection between Belgium and Denmark. This very positive project for Belgium, also for Europe, but not for Denmark for the moment, because the price of the material increased, and then it's not a positive project for the moment for Denmark. And the consequence of that with the actual framework is that the project is delayed. That we need absolutely to change the rule of the games, otherwise we'll never achieve the targets that Europe has fixed for offshore wind.
Right, so we really need that kind of pan-European collaborative approach, just like we've been saying throughout this evening.
Exactly.
Thank you very much for joining me.
Sure.
It's now time to move on to the last element of our virtuous circle, scaling up the supply chain. This has become an important area of focus. We must ensure we have access to the right materials, equipment, and skills if we want to fulfill Europe's ambitious goals.
First of all, we need to somehow overcome, I think, the supply chain bottlenecks. So, yeah, to do that through ramping up with the production capacity, but also to simplify, I think, the procurement processes, and then to strengthen the supply chain. Secondly, I would say it's not just about cost, it's also about economy, about employability. All the investment needed would require more than 300,000 jobs. Well, so that is also, I think, really good for the economy. And then maybe the last one, it's about the potential. We are currently looking into 300 gigawatts until 2050 to be deployed. But if you would look beyond the North Sea, and if you would do it even smarter, I think you look at a potential of up to 500 gigawatt.
Decarbonization can become a source of growth, and this was one of the conclusions of the Draghi report. In terms of offshore wind development, this means scaling up the supply chain and securing raw material imports. At the same time, as our fourth key message states, this will offer up growth opportunities along with the creation of 300,000 jobs across Europe, as mentioned just by Manon van Beek. Maria, Europe is a frontrunner in terms of offshore wind. If you look at a supply chain, where can we find our champions in Europe?
So as it turns out, there's not one champion, but there are many of them for different components. So if you are looking now on the map on the screen, we have one example here. So this is one project, the Arcades Ost 1, which was developed from Parkwind, a Belgian wind operator, and then connected to the 50 Hertz grid. And we see here that the components came from all over Europe. So for example, if we are taking the steel structure, which came from Poland, or if we are taking some of those cables, they came from Sweden or were manufactured in Sweden and Germany. So you really see that we have to all work together, that this is coming together to the one wind farm.
Yeah, it's quite impressive if you see the map. I wasn't aware of this, but it's only a snapshot of one project. If you look at the European map, where can you find the big factories in offshore wind?
Yeah. The map of the European supply chain is actually underlining quite well what Maria just said. There's no such thing as a European champion that is mastering the whole supply chain. What do we rather see? We see that there are many complementary and specialized hubs that are actually supplying the offshore wind sector today. If we have a closer look on the map, what do we see there? We actually see the manufacturing sites for wind turbines, we see the hubs for logistics, for operation and maintenance, but we also see the important components for the grid assets, as well as the shipyards for offshore platforms. Now, I would like to invite you to actually have a look for 1 minute on the yellow icons, because they represent recent investments that have been made in the grid. And as Stefan pointed out before, the supply chain is very essential. So it is positive to point out that actually investments have been happening here. And what is particularly interesting in this regard to mention as well is that there's two segments. On the one hand side, countries that are already very established, like Belgium, the UK, Germany, are seeing investments into new factories, but also new emerging markets are coming to the map. You can take Poland, which is a very prominent example in this regard as well, but you can also take the Mediterranean Sea or Scotland.
Or the Baltics. The Baltics on the map, yeah. Okay, one thing to note is that all of the studies maps, including the ones that we just discussed, can be accessed online. And some of the maps include multiple layers, like this one, which allows us to see different interconnectors. And I've already played a little bit with the maps on the site, and they are a real cool addition to this study, just as a side remark. Okay, let's go back to the supply chain map. The readers of this map, they could conclude that we already have the manufacturing capabilities. If you see all the colors on the map, but your analysis from the study is not so positive.
That's true, Marlene, because when we actually compare the current European manufacturing capacities with the forecasted demand, we have to come to the conclusion that we must scale up significantly. The ratios for that actually become valuable by the map that we see on the screen right now, where we actually compare the current European manufacturing capacities with the forecasted demand between 2030 and 2050 for main asset components like wind turbines, cables, and HVDC converters. And yeah, what we see is that actually for all those segments, we will have to scale up. If you take the turbines, we will have to double the European production capacities. If you take the cables, it is the same. And it becomes even more striking when we look at the converter side, because there we will have to triple. Now, of course, one could also argue that not everything has to be supplied. The supply chain from Europe, because the supply chain is actually globally. And that's very true. Something can come also from the global supply chains. But we also have to keep in mind that we are talking about very critical infrastructure here, meaning that not automatically all international suppliers will qualify to work in the European market. So this is underlining also very strongly that the European leaders really have to take those targets that are out there that we're talking about today and make them binding and reliable, such that the trust of the supply chain is increased, that investments will happen. And while looking at the challenges, I think it's also worthwhile to have a look at the opportunities. And you've already said it, Manon said it, there's the opportunity to actually increase the number of jobs significantly, about 300,000 jobs in Europe possible.
Okay, so what are we waiting for? Thank you, Moritz. Thank you, Maria.
We've now explored the different elements of the virtuous circle of offshore wind benefits in Europe. But what next steps are needed? Before we invite Katrin Vandenborder on stage to share her concluding thoughts with us, let's hear from some of our expert stakeholders.
Ja, wir sehen auf der einen Seite riesige Potenziale für Offshore-Wind und wir sehen auf der anderen aber auch, dass wir diese Potenziale nur zu einem Teil nutzen und dass vielleicht dieser Nutzen auch nur zu einem Teil bei den europäischen Wertschöpfungsleadern ankommt. Und das wäre eine Bitte oder Botschaft auch an eine neue Europäische Kommission, die sich gerade konstituiert, an das neue Europäische Parlament, auch darauf zu achten, dass in dem Aufbau der Wertschöpfungsketten es gelingt, einen Teil auch hier in Europa zu halten, aufzubauen. Es gibt viele Wege dahin. Das eine hat mit Regulierung zu tun, mit Ausschreibungsdesign, Frage, was für Rolle können qualitative Kriterien spielen, um die Resilienz der hiesigen Wertschöpfungsketten zu stärken, aber auch einen Mehrwert und eine Vielfalt sozusagen in den Ausschreibungen selbst mit zu verankern. Das wäre eine ganz zentrale Botschaft, denn ich glaube, in einem geopolitisch immer schwierigeren Umfeld bleibt es wichtig, dass wir auch als europäische Industrie hier stark bleiben.
I think we have demonstrated over the last decades that we're the technology leader in Europe in offshore wind across the whole supply chain, not just the turbines, but installations, how we do things. And in order to keep that, I think it's also setting the right boundary conditions. I think in a fair competition, we can be really the leader and continue to be the leader. And I think that's the important part, to set the right boundary condition, that we have a fair and open competition to make sure we maintain that leadership.
Maintaining the leadership, this is precisely what is at stake right now for the offshore industry. There are competitors on the horizon, like China, for example. So to conclude, let's talk about the next steps. Katrin, welcome back. What should we do?
Maybe let's first start with what we have. We have a leading industry in terms of offshore. We have also a very clear vision and ambition, 500 gigawatts by 2050. And finally, we have a substantive set of regulation to achieve the goal. So what we need to do now is really work on incentives to ramp up the supply chain. It was already said, we absolutely need to find a framework in order to incentivize suppliers to develop their production capacity. I think that offshore wind now is very much about equipment and producing equipment, and much more than that than technology. And of course, there is an opportunity that was already pointed by Maria and by Maurice. If we look at the map on the spreading of the supply chain over Europe, we see that there is no national champion, but there are many countries participating to the manufacturing of the offshore equipment. And so that's a real opportunity if we develop some kind of incentive framework to have jobs being created over Europe and not in one country in particular.
Yeah.
So there is a potential to have what I like to call some kind of Silicon Valleys of the offshore. We can imagine a number of hubs with a focus on cable, focus on platform, focus on vessels, focus on dredging capabilities. There was enough activities for many European countries.
Yeah. And to boost this supply chain, is that something that we as a system operator could do?
Sure. So I think, first of all, we need to be very transparent about the needs that we have in terms of equipment, and that's something we are very committed to work on. Second element, we need also to work on standardization of the offshore equipment for transmission. We already have a standard for the cables, the 525 kV cables, but we can do more in terms of platform, and we can do more in terms of multi-vendor technology, where we need to work hand in hand with the supplier in order to have technologies that allow for good communication between equipment coming from different suppliers.
Yeah, that's for the supply chain. The other elements of the virtuous circle, financing, planning, what about this?
Yeah, so I think first it was said we absolutely need to move away from the 50-50% rules in terms of sharing of cost and benefit. We need to evolve towards another European system that will fairly distribute the cost and the benefits according to the actual electricity flows. That's one. Second, in terms of funding, I think that the EIB, the European Investment Bank, has a role to play in terms of giving guarantees to a number of projects that will allow to leverage the money that we can invest in the offshore developments. And finally, in terms of planning, we will collaborate together with the other TSOs around the North Sea and the Baltic Sea basin. We have as a focus the Hamburg Summit of June 2025, where we intend to come with the first proposal in terms of common planning of interconnectors that could be developed in the truly benefits of Europe. So let's make sure that we deliver for this Hamburg Summit in terms of common planification.
Yeah, that would indeed be an important first step. Today we are not only discussing the paper, but we are also working on the first concrete steps. I have one last question for you, Catherine. It's a tradition at the end of the presentation of the Elia Group study that we also reveal the next study. Could you say something about next year's topic?
Yeah, we have decided to work on energy storage. We have seen during the summer that we have an increased solar incompressibility. We still have some rest congestion in the system. In the past, we looked at how flexibility could help solving this issue. Flexibility is, of course, still important, but next to that, we want to see how energy storage can help solving those challenges in the future.
Okay, indeed, an interesting topic. Thank you for the challenge, and thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you to the team.
All elements of the virtuous circle have been addressed. It's time to say goodbye. We'd like to extend a big thank you to everyone who contributed to the report and to the technical team here in the studio for a flawless show. As well, of course, thank you, Helen and Marlene. It may all seem effortless, but a lot of hard work has gone into it all. So, ladies and gentlemen, you can find the complete study on our website, along with a link to the interactive maps that accompany it. Thank you to everyone at home for joining us. We would like to invite our guests in the audience to join us for a drink to celebrate. Thank you all very much, and good evening.